Hello everyone, I'm Martin, the host and author of short stories. Today's story was inspired by Russia's comically tragic history. It's titled Boris Godunov. Boris Godunov was the Tsar of Russia from 1598 to his death in 1605. The end of his reign marked the beginning of a period in Russian history known as the Time of Troubles. Modest Mussorgsky, a Russian composer, wrote an opera about this ill-fated monarch in the 1860s. The opera premiered in 1874 in St. Petersburg, Russia. It is Mussorgsky's only finished opera, and it is considered his masterpiece. Mussorgsky based this opera off of the writings of Alexander Pushkin, Russia's greatest poet, according to many. This story has been modified from its original version. It has been formatted to fit this screen. Vocabulary: coup, or coup d'etat. The government of Myanmar was overthrown by a military coup. Heir. Prince William is the heir to the British throne. Hobo. The hobo traveled from town to town, begging for money. Lose one's head. To lose one's head. Everyone lost their heads when Trump was elected. Monk. The monks prayed every morning in the chapel. On the house. Everyone cheered when the bartender announced that all drinks were on the house. Pretend. You can go to jail for pretending to be a police officer. Brain aneurysm. Also known as a stroke. The old man died from a brain aneurysm, or the old man died from a stroke. A crowd of peasants gathered outside Ivan the Great's bell tower inside the Moscow Kremlin. The year was 1598, and the heir to the throne was dead. "What's all this about?" asked a young peasant lad. "I don't know. I'm only here because the police captain threatened to beat me," answered a middle-aged man. An elderly, wild-eyed hobo overheard their conversation and said, "Hee, here we go again. A new Tsar is about to be proclaimed." The two younger peasants looked at him quizzically. "Dmitri is dead," the young lad pointed out. "How can there be a new Tsar?" The old man laughed maniacally and replied, "Just wait and see." The police captain stood up on a platform and banged on an old tin bucket to get everyone's attention. "We've gathered you here today because we know how much you love and respect Boris Godunov," he bellowed. The crowd was silent until the young peasant lad spoke up. "Who?" The captain held out his arms in front of him, palms up, and said, "Boris Godunov, the regent, the one in charge of taking care of the heir to the throne." The middle-aged man raised his hand and asked, "Didn't the heir to the throne just die?" The captain conceded that point, and the peasant replied, "Then he obviously didn't do a good job, did he?" The captain tried to reassure the crowd that the accidental death of Dmitri was beyond anyone's control. "What did he die of?" asked the young lad. The crowd became agitated, and chants of tell us," could be heard. "I have the official report right here," said the captain confidently. "Prime Minister Shusky himself led the inquiry, and he determined that The captain paused to read the report. Determined that the heir to the throne died when he accidentally cut his own throat while having an epileptic seizure. This got the crowd really agitated. Shouts of "Murderer!" could be heard. The captain ordered one of his officers to beat the man who had yelled that. The crowd fell silent. The captain cleared his throat and began speaking. The good and noble Boris Godunov, father of the nation, protector of the innocent, has been offered the crown and refused. Someone in the crowd yelled, "Then why are we here?" The policeman stiffened his stance and answered, "We're here to encourage him to change his mind and accept the throne. Now, let's show Boris how much we love him." The crowd stood as silently as a fence post. The captain ordered one of his officers to beat up another serf, and the crowd finally took the hint. The square was now filled with cheering serfs. Boris appeared on the balcony overlooking the square, and he waved gently. He was wearing a simple monk's hood, and looked almost as humble as the serfs beneath him. "Like the beautiful sun in the sky, glory, glory!" shouted the police captain as he waved his hands emphatically. Several policemen prodded the peasants closest to them to proclaim, "Glory, glory!" Boris raised both his hands to call for silence. Then a procession of boyars, dressed in their finest robes, filed out of the bell tower. They formed two lines, clearing a path for Boris Godunov, who exited the building next. Now dressed in his royal robes and wearing a crown, Boris addressed the audience. "My soul grieves for the lost heir," he began, "but the kingdom must go on. So it is with a heavy heart that I accept the responsibility of ruling over all of you." The boyars all raised their hands and began chanting, "Long live the king!" The peasants reacted with muted expressions of approval and a smattering of applause. "Now I'd like to invite all the peasants present here to a grand feast at my palace. All food and drink is on the house." This time the peasants reacted with cheers of excitement and a deafening applause. Boris Godunov looked at his police captain and smiled. The elderly hobo began singing an odd song. Those who stopped to listen noticed that the mournful words didn't match the upbeat melody. The crazy hobo smiled, displaying his few remaining and yellowing teeth, and sang, "Flow, flow, bitter tears for Russia." Two monks were in the basement of the Chudov monastery. One was scribbling away on a report about local miracles. The other was tinkering with a broken vodka still. The year was 1603, and Boris Godunov had been on the throne for 5 years. "Can you keep it down?" complained Pimen. "I'm trying to concentrate on something important." Grigory made no attempt to quiet his tinkering and replied, "I'm concentrating on something important too." A minute later, Grigory threw down his tools and proclaimed, "This is all Godunov's fault." Pimen paused his work and looked at his holy brother. "What are you jabbering about?" he asked. "Ever since Tsar Godunov allowed the Lutherans in, we've been losing worshippers. We need to get this still fixed so that we can draw them back." "How will vodka save their souls?" asked Pimen. "Who said anything about saving souls?" replied Grigory. "The more worshippers we have, the more donations we get. The more donations we get, the more vodka I can drink. Do you understand now?" Pimen scoffed and returned to his work. "It could be worse," he muttered. "You could be the Tsar." This last sentence got stuck in Grigory's brain. He sat for a long time, silently staring at his own dirty shoes. "I could be the Tsar," he finally declared. "Thank you, Pimen. You've been most helpful." Grigory stood up and ran out of the basement, leaving Pimen alone and confused. 3 vagrants walked into an inn in a village on the Lithuanian border. The first vagrant, named Varlam, walked up to the bar and ordered a drink. The second vagrant, named Misael, went around the room to beg for some change to pay for that drink. The third vagrant, who was actually Grigory in disguise, walked up to the hostess and asked for directions to the nearest border crossing. The hostess had been working in this inn for some time, so she knew right away that this customer was not interested in the official border crossing. "Avoid the toll road," she advised. "There's an unofficial border crossing about 2 miles north of here. Just follow the stream through the woods, and you'll be in Lithuania in about an hour." Grigory thanked her for the advice and ordered a drink. As the night wore on, Varlam and Misael became increasingly drunk. This was made possible by Misael's unique begging technique. The powerful stench of his unwashed body encouraged potential donors to contribute their spare change in order to rid themselves of Misael's presence. Eventually, Varlam and Misael became drunk enough to sing, and sing they did, of Ivan the Terrible's siege of Kazan. All singing and chatting stopped when the local sheriff entered the inn. Everyone watched as he strode slowly into the center of the room. "I'm looking for a runaway monk named Grigory. If anyone has seen him, please step forward," announced the sheriff in the loud and slow accent of a peasant. One of the customers raised his hand and asked, "What does this monk look like?" The sheriff took out the police report and squinted. "I don't know," he admitted. "I can't read." Grigory, sensing an opportunity, stepped forward and volunteered his services. "I can read that for you," he offered. Grigory began reading the description of the fugitive, but instead of his own description, he substituted with the description of Varlam. "I see him right over there, officer," shouted a customer. The sheriff immediately stomped over to where Varlam was slumping over the table. He grabbed the vagrant by the hair and lifted up his head and declared, "You're under arrest, Grigory." Varlam, being quite drunk, was slow to respond. Misael argued with the sheriff. "His name isn't Grigory." The sheriff held up the report and retorted, "Yes, it is. He matches the description exactly." Misael took a look at the report. It may surprise you to learn that before he became a smelly vagrant, Misael had been a bureaucrat in Ivan the Terrible's government. He had lost his position and wealth due to the machinations of a jealous boyar. And unlike the illiterate sheriff who was frowning in front of him, Misael could read. "This isn't his description. This is the description of that man over there." But it was too late. Grigory had already gone out the door and on his way to Lithuania, where he planned to raise an army of anti-Russian Poles and take the throne of Moscow. Xenia sat inside the main hall of the Tsar's palace in the Kremlin. She held a locket in her right hand and looked at the portrait inside with a sorrowful sigh. The year was 1605, and Tsar Boris was about to learn some disturbing news. "Where are you, my bridegroom?" moaned Xenia Godunova. Fyodor sighed and said, "Not this again, sis. When are you going to get over that German putz?" Xenia had been engaged to Prince Johann of Schleswig-Holstein until the day he tragically died of food poisoning. "Why do all of my fiancés die of food poisoning?" she groaned. Boris walked into the room and greeted his children warmly. He tried his best to console his daughter Xenia. "I'll find you another prince to marry, sweetie," he said while gently patting her shoulders. He then turned his attention to his 16-year-old son, Fyodor. "How's school going?" he asked. "It's going well, Dad. Do you want to see the map I made in geography class?" Boris clapped his hands and said that he'd love to nothing more than to see his son's work. Fyodor ran excitedly to the storage bin in the corner of the room and pulled out a large tube of paper. He unrolled it on the dining table and eagerly awaited his father's words of approval. Those words of approval were slow in coming, because what Boris saw on the table before him was a messy tangle of lines and words that had been scrawled on a piece of yellow paper. "It's your kingdom, Dad," said Fyodor eagerly. "Look here, that's Moscow, and over there is Tobolsk. Look how big your kingdom is." This last statement made Boris feel proud. "It is big, isn't it, son?" he said with a slap on Fyodor's shoulder. "I have attained supreme power, and one day I will pass it on to you." This tender father-son moment was interrupted by a messenger announcing the arrival of Prime Minister Shusky. "Ugh, I hate that guy. All right, let him in." Fyodor asked his father why he felt so negatively about his own prime minister. Boris leaned in close and whispered, "He's the one who poisoned Prince Johann." Boris turned to his daughter and said in a gentle voice, "Sweetie, why don't you go mourn over your deceased boyfriend in another room? Daddy needs to take care of business." Xenia wiped a tear from her eyes and complied with her father's wishes. Shusky entered and bowed before his Tsar. "I bring troubling news, sire," he announced gravely. "What is it?" Boris asked. "A pretender claiming to be Prince Dmitri has announced himself in Lithuania. Our spies indicate that he has recruited an army and is preparing to march into Russia." Boris staggered backward and fell into a chair. His heart was pounding as a tingling pain shot through his left arm. "My God! My nightmares were true!" he gasped. "I dreamed that a bloody child was begging me for mercy." Shusky and Fyodor looked at each other with concern plastered all over their faces. "Seal the border," bellowed Boris. "Don't let this phony prince anywhere near me." That night, Boris's dreams were worse than before. He dreamed that he was being interrogated by the ghost of young Prince Dmitri. He began shouting in his sleep, "Begone! Begone, child!" The peasants gathered in front of St. Basil's Cathedral like they did every Sunday. They were waiting for church services to end because that was when the Tsar and his loyal boyars exited the church and distributed alms to the poor. "Did you hear?" said the young peasant lad to the middle-aged man. "Prince Dmitri is pretending to be a monk named Grigory." The older man shook his head and replied, "No, no, you've got it backwards. A monk named Grigory is pretending to be Prince Dmitri." The young man scratched his rashy neck and said, "Well, whoever he is, I hope he gives more coins than this Boris guy." There was a commotion in the crowd as the crazed hobo from Act 1 came prancing into the scene, singing, "The moon is flying, the kitten is crying." This merry song was halted by the cruelty of two street urchins, who decided to steal the old fool's last coin. "Stop! My coin!" yelled the gray hobo as he tried to chase the boys through the crowd. Sadly, his frail elderly body was unable to keep up with the thieving youths. He slumped down onto his knees and started softly crying. Suddenly, the bell of the church started to ring, indicating the end of church services. The young lad started rubbing his hands in anticipation. The Tsar and his boyars exited the church with their heads held high, and they smiled as their servants handed out coins to people. Boris stopped when he saw the crying hobo and asked him what was wrong. The hobo explained how two thieves had run off with his only coin. Boris offered to give him a new coin, to which the hobo replied, "I'd rather you punish those boys like you did to Dmitri." Shusky gasped, and the boyars were stunned into silence. "Guards!" yelled Shusky. "Arrest this man!" Boris canceled that order and smiled awkwardly at the old fool. "In that case," he said, "I'd like you to pray for me." The hobo laughed and responded, "The Mother of God will not allow me to pray for Tsar Herod. Ha ha!" Boris turned ghostly pale and quickly escaped into the safety of the Kremlin. Shusky ordered the old man to be thrown into the dungeon. And as he was being led away, the hobo sang, "Flow, flow, bitter tears for Russia." "Order! Order, everyone!" shouted Shusky from the speaker's podium in the meeting hall of the Duma. All the boyars of the kingdom had gathered to discuss the matter of the pretender. "I know this news is alarming, but we mustn't lose our heads over it," Shusky said with a voice of calm authority. "We must decide as a body whether to support this pretender to the throne or stick with Tsar Godunov." One of Shusky's allies stood up and said, "Well, let's put it to a vote, fellas." The boyars voted, and the result was as Shusky expected. They voted to stick with Tsar Godunov. "The motion is passed," he cried as he struck his gavel. "Now for the next order of business," said Shusky as he flipped through his papers. "I have disturbing news about the Tsar's mental health. He has behaved somewhat erratically lately. He hasn't been sleeping well, and when he does sleep, he shouts, 'Begone, child!'" The boyars started murmuring anxiously. One of the less loyal boyars raised his hand and asked, "Do you have any proof of this?" Shusky called for Fyodor, who strode up to the speaker's podium. "The crown prince can corroborate my statements," announced Shusky. The murmuring of the boyars grew louder and more anxious. One of the more loyal boyars raised his hand and asked, "If the Tsar is unwell, who will lead the country in its greatest hour of need?" Shusky smiled and replied, "Fyodor and I have worked out an agreement. He will be acting Tsar until his father is well, and I will be his regent, as well as prime minister." The less loyal boyar stood up and said, "This looks an awful lot like a palace coup." Shusky laughed and said, "Fellas, you can trust me." But the disloyal boyar was not satisfied. "I want to talk to the Tsar myself before I sign off on this." Shusky's smile disappeared, and he said, "Fine, you can see him tomorrow." Boris Godunov was lying in bed. He had a terrible headache, and his vision was blurry. "Who's there?" he mumbled. Shusky walked forward and announced himself. He then introduced a few boyars who had accompanied him. "They have come to see you, and to cheer up their Tsar," he told the ailing monarch. Boris sat up quickly and said, "I'm quite all right. I need to get back to the Duma, so I can address all the boyars and let them know that their kingdom still has a leader." Shusky put a calming hand on his shoulder and told him that he had another visitor. "I invited a holy monk to come and talk to you about your dreams. I think, with his help, you'll be as right as rain." Shusky called in Pimen the monk. Pimen bowed to his monarch and introduced himself. Boris thanked him for coming, but added that his visit really wasn't necessary. "Shusky insisted that I help you," said the monk. Boris consented and began describing his most recent dream. Pimen's eyes widened as he listened carefully. He then said, "I also have a story to tell of another man's dream." The story was about a blind man who heard Prince Dmitri speak to him in a dream. Dmitri instructed him to go to his grave and pray. The blind man did as he was instructed, and after he finished his last prayer, he found that his sight had been returned. "It was a miracle," declared the monk. This was too much for Boris to bear. "Arg!" he groaned. The boyars looked on in horror as the Tsar's face began to droop and his face turn red. My son! Boris moaned. Shuisky called in Fyodor, who knelt next to his father's bed. "Farewell, my son. Be a good Tsar. Don't let that pretender have the throne. Long may you reign." Arr! With one final burst of his brain aneurysm, the Tsar was dead. Fyodor Godunov only lasted on the throne for 1 month. Shuisky announced that he had died of food poisoning. The boyars in Moscow sent out a diplomatic delegation to the pretender, hoping to reach a negotiated settlement. "Fat chance," laughed Dmitri, a.k.a. Grigory, as he wadded up the boyar's letter. "It's Moscow or bust," he declared before an assembly of serfs. They had gathered in the forest not far from the city to greet their new monarch. "3 cheers for Prince Dmitri," shouted the young lad. "Isn't he too old to be Dmitri?" asked the middle-aged man. "Who cares?" cried Varlam. Misail was there too, hoping to revive his bureaucratic career with the help of the new Tsar. The mob of peasants and soldiers slowly swept through the forest and onto the Moscow River basin. All manner of songs, cheers, and shouts of joy could be heard from that great assemblage, and trailing behind them was the crazy hobo, singing, "Flow, flow, bitter tears for Russia." The questions. Number 1. According to the official report, how did Prince Dmitri die? A. Brain aneurysm. B. Poison. C. Accident. D. Heart attack. The answer is C. Accident. Question 2. How do the peasants feel about Boris Godunov? A. They love him. B. They hate him. C. They don't care about him. D. They are loyal to him. The answer is C. They don't care about him. Question 3. What is Grigory's idea? A. To pretend to be Dmitri. B. To pretend to be Boris. C. To marry Xenia. D. To move to Lithuania. The answer is A. To pretend to be Dmitri. Question 4. How did Boris Godunov die? A. Accident. B. Brain aneurysm. C. Poisoning. D. Heart attack. The answer is B. Brain aneurysm, also called a stroke.